going to get through this. I'm not going to look at every one of the examples that I have in my notes. We've been on this study for a long time, or 3 weeks now, and I want to get to the main point of it. So I'm going to make sure that we get to the idea of, some of the things that we ourselves need to do. And obviously, we've seen those things throughout some of our discussions, some of our scriptures, but to actually put it down. But I did want to bring up one more, and this is a group of people, actually. If you remember the story with Joshua and Caleb and the 12 spies, they were 2 of the spies. They went into the land of, give me a name for this land. Canaan. Give me another. That's correct. Land of promise. Land of promise. And the reason I'm saying that is just the situation. They were told it was theirs. So their faith completely being in a weak state, the fear pulled them away. You wonder sometimes, and a lot of times when we see pictures of Israel, it seems like it's desert and dry and arid. And there are parts of Israel that are like that. But I was just actually the other day looking on the WVBS site and checking out some of the videos. And one of the videos was entitled, I forget what the exact title was, but it was talking about Canaan and why it was called the land of milk and honey. And basically they did some aerial, probably drone footage and things, and they showed some of the areas and talked about some of the regions. And really, Israel's region is unbelievable. I mean, really, it's not a deserty area only. I mean, there are regions that are kind of like that, but there's also arid and regions where they can grow and has great soil and all kinds of things like that. So it's the land of promise. They were afraid. They said the people were make them look like grasshoppers. We cannot do this. That was the problem right there. We cannot do this. Really, there's an awful lot of things that probably you should be afraid of going through without God's help. To the point of, maybe even backing down. Not only had they been told about the promise, some saw it, but they let their fears overrule. So they saw the land. They saw what it could produce. They saw what it was that God was giving to them. But they weren't permitted to go in. And it was their own decision that made that. It was their fear. It was the fear of the people. So, we look at some of these things, and, another one, just to look at an example, one example in the New Testament, one that we're very familiar with. I'm going to jump a few slides ahead here. Peter was one. We know his denial to Jesus. It was obviously 100% out of fear. He was afraid. He was scared. But he did boast. He said, I would never do that. Then he denied 3 times. What was it that, and this is something that we ourselves today have feared before. Well, what was it that Peter was so fearful about in the situation when he denied Jesus? What was the environment like? What's that? Yeah, it definitely could have turned hostile towards a believer in Jesus, a follower of his, sure. Yeah. And when the servant girl brought up, wait, weren't you one of his? Oh, no, I don't want anyone to know that. He was frightened. He was scared. And you know what? It goes to show what a group of people can do over one individual sometimes. And when you're by yourself, fear can be intense when you're the only one that has to do it. If you have a support system, if we have brothers and sisters in Christ, we have God that we can lean on, those things are going to help us. And then, 1 Corinthians 10, verse 12, just really kind of brings this point out. Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed unless he falls. Peter was very sure that he was going to stick up for Jesus. As a matter of fact, he tried at first. He pulled a sword out when he was with everybody, when he was with the group. But you know, the one thing about Peter is he may have been frightened in this scenario and denied Jesus. But there's nowhere after this, I think, that you could find even Peter by himself, and you could say that man was afraid to stand up for God. It wouldn't have happened again. Whether he was with a group of the apostles or if he was by himself. You know, you could look at other examples in Acts chapter 5, when the disciples were brought in before the Sanhedrin, and they beat them, threw them in prison. They told them that they wanted them to stop preaching Jesus. They weren't going to do it. They said, if it's what God wants us to do, we're going to follow through with it. So this brings us down. We'll jump a little bit more here. And this is where I wanted to make sure we got into this evening. So how do we overcome fear? Remember, we talked about fear. There's nothing wrong with having fear as long as the fear is not holding us back. Sometimes fear will motivate us to move forward. I think in a lot of examples as Christians, sometimes the fear of not being with God and going to hell makes us push harder to be obedient, to be stronger. You know, obviously, to admit something, though, we need to have some self-control. We need to be able to self-examine ourselves. Not always an easy thing to do. I'll tell you what, if you want a better view of what you look like, and this is not a negative remark, this is a compliment, get married. Because your wife will be honest with you. When you're falling short of something, you'll be told. And I'm not, like I said, I'm not saying that in a way to be derogatory towards Christy. Christy has improved me as a person since I met her, and she's still trying. She thinks she's failing, but she's still trying. She's still putting the effort in. But it's that idea that sometimes we need somebody else to look at us and say, hey, you have a problem. There have been times in my life where I had an issue and didn't even know it until someone explained it to me. Someone, you know, whether you're talking about as being a child, mom and dad explaining something to you, as an adult, a friend, a family member explaining something that you got wrong. You know, why don't I take a firm stand, even at a crowd of those who are against God? Why do I not back away from opportunities to show others my faith? You know, it's just examples there. You know, in the scenario that a lot of times that can be a scary thing when you're going into an environment where you don't know what people are going to say. You know, we need to be willing to look to God and say, I have a problem. I have something that is holding me back. There's a fear that is not letting me live. And just like anything else, you know, if we admit there's a problem, what's the next thing you think we would have to do? We got to figure out what that problem is, right? We got to know exactly what it is so that we can fix it. You know, I've heard probably one of the funniest things I heard in a long time was a couple years ago. This comedian, his name was Brian Regan. He's a very clean comedian. He's one of those ones, if you looked, he would be a good one to listen to even as a Christian. But he was talking about how he has no clue how his automobile works and how stupid he feels when he goes into the auto mechanic, because he goes in there and they'll say, well, what's wrong? And then he says, well, then I start to try to imitate the sounds and the things that I'm hearing, but it doesn't really get us very far. You know, here it is. He knows. Okay, he's saying my car has a problem. You know, it's making a noise it shouldn't. It's it's making a sound that shouldn't be happening. But now you got to go somewhere to identify it. Well, you know, sometimes with ourselves, we might not be able to identify what it is that's holding us back. Matter of fact, I have seen people who are afraid of things completely ignore the fear and act like it's not there. Now, they don't move forward in any way, but they just try to avoid it. They just try to forget about it, pretend it's not there. But the most important thing about identifying this is really the knowledge of knowing how to control something. You know, for instance, I mentioned last week or the week before the idea of how our mind can play tricks on us. And especially as a little kid, you might have seen a shadow on the wall in your dark room, and it looked like something coming out of the wall, and it scared you to death. And you called for mom or dad, and they turn the lights on, and it's gone. They point out, it's this shadow off of here, and you know what it is, but as soon as that light goes off, it still looks creepy. And it still looks exactly like what you thought it was before, even though you know it's not. And I know that's, from a child's perspective, but as adults, we do the same thing. We could honestly have the answer right in front of us sometimes, and because we're so afraid, we won't take the steps that we need to in order to fix whatever the issue is. Why is someone afraid? What causes fear? Fear of protection, you're not safe?
Fear of
rejection. Okay, yeah. Fear of rejection, not knowing the response you're going to get. Fear of the unknown. Yeah, we don't know where we're going to go, what's going to happen. There's numerous things that we could add to that list as far as things we're fearful of. Just on the slide there, the bullet point number 3, it's some of the reasons maybe, well, I can't talk to that person, they're smarter than me. More people like them than me. Stronger, more powerful, taller, angrier, richer. They'll make us look bad. Have you ever run any type of thought like that through your head before? And psyched yourself out? I mean, have you ever done that and then finally sat down and gone through what it was, maybe sitting down and talking with someone, and after you walked away, you just thought, why did I stress myself out so much? I had a meeting that I had to do. It was a staff issue at the church camp last summer, and I had to go down to the camp, and I had to talk to a camper face to face, and I'll tell you what, it was a very difficult thing to do. To tell someone that they're not able to work because of things that they're saying or ways that they're acting, not being like a Christian. But I'll tell you what, it scared me, because here I was going to talk, and it was a very, I'm not going to get into detail or whatever, but it was a very important thing. I mean, it really was something that needed to be identified and looked at and understood. When I got to the camp, I don't know if any of you guys know Jamie McCoy from the camp. Well, his daughter happened to be there, who happens to be, she works in some kind of social services with people and deals with problems and issues like that all the time. And, he asked me, you want her to go and sit with you guys? And I thought, someone with experience in something like this? Sure, absolutely. But what I'm trying to get at is I can remember afterwards, as sad as the whole thing was, because it was sad that I had to tell someone they couldn't work, I walked away from it going, whew, it wasn't as hard as I thought. I was afraid I was going to not have the word to say or the right thing or and there were so many thoughts that were going through my mind, and really, it was taking place and it was going to happen, so really all I was doing was tormenting myself. And then when I got there and went through the situation, I thought, you know what, it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. And we do that. Sometimes we psych ourselves out, things we shouldn't be afraid of, but at other times, there are things we should be. Oh, absolutely, yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and I probably should have I prayed about it a lot. So that was on my mind to do that, but it was still self-sabotage. That was the problem. It's not that I didn't trust God. It's not that I didn't think He would help me or put me in a place where I couldn't handle something. It was self-sabotage. I was making something out to be worse than it was. Now, how did I know? I mean, I could have sat down and talked with this individual, and this individual could have got up and just started screaming and being belligerent and, causing trouble, and thankfully it didn't go that way. But I mean, that's something I was concerned about. Saying something that was going to offend somebody, but I was right about, not saying it in a way where I was trying to offend somebody. And then there's another issue that has to be dealt with down, because of that. And I'm just trying to point out simply how our minds can really mess us up at times. I mean, they really can. Eric?
Sometimes it's as far as wanting to talk to somebody about Christ, we think of it in terms of what we're going to say about Christ as our opening sentence. And yet, Jesus once started a conversation with, "But I can have a drink, please."
Right. Yeah.
And a lot of times it's just a matter of just working into it.
Mm-hmm.
Share your life,
Right.
doing, and at some point, they may next. But it's, we shouldn't psych ourselves out trying to think about our opening sentence.
Right.
Sentence like that. Did you know you're going to hell? I mean,
Might want to work on that one.
yeah, that's that way, so I'm afraid of that. So,
Right.
yeah, there's other ways to begin the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So that brings in the idea to take one more step further. Don't overthink it, because it just gets us into too much trouble. Just thinking about the potential negatives. Now, I'm not standing up here telling you that you guys have never been afraid of something that was a concern that turned out to be something tough and you had to deal with it at that time. But what I'm saying is, a lot of the times, even in those cases, we can make those situations even worse for ourselves. I mean, you imagine the stress that you can put on your body when you're afraid of something? I mean, people have literally become frozen, passed out. I don't know, there's probably numerous other things that have happened to people over stress, over fear, over things like that, where the body just says, maybe the brain says, okay, we're shutting down. It's just, this is not working right. And, so we need to be very careful about those types of things. The hero says, I don't think about the danger, I just react. Well, I understand that statement to an extent, because if you sit back and you worry about all the danger beforehand and you never act, then you can't accomplish anything. But if you're also not aware, and that's why I think fear is a good thing. Fear can make us aware, to look around, to be on our toes, on our feet. Depends on the test. I was really worried about not passing my driver's test. Yes, Sarah, and then I'll get Marge.
I've heard it said courage is not having fear, facing fear and going forward.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, courage is, what's the point of being courageous if there's not something to be afraid of? Something to overcome, something to get beyond. Yeah, so yeah, that's a very good statement. Marge? Yes. Yeah. And I think that's more or less what the hero is trying to say. I'm just going to go do it. But, along with like what Christy said, has anyone ever been around a fire? Anyone ever been in a fire? Okay, that's good. Mike, maybe, kind of, sort of? Something caught on? Okay, yeah. Well, that's the route I was going anyways. I was just thinking, You know, have you ever gone through your house and turned all your lights off in the middle of the night and tried to walk around? It's not as hard for you because you know where you're at, but you can still run into things. And kind of what Christy was saying is that you put this stuff to action. You practice. Do you think a fireman's ever been inside of a smoky building before they went into a real scenario? There's practice, right? They have those buildings that they do and those things, and they try to get themselves aware and used to those things. I mean, imagine if you sent someone into a fight a fire and you didn't teach them even how to use the water hose or the respirators to breathe. And you said, just go get it. Melissa? Right, and obviously more mature in your spirituality means you have more knowledge of the scriptures. You're prayerful. Your faith is being built up because of that. And absolutely, yeah, it's that preparation. And we also, I think sometimes there are some of us that just need to grow a little extra skin in some situations. And I'm not saying that in a negative way, but I think some of us may realize that maybe we're too overly sensitive about some of these types of things where it affects us badly. And I'm not telling you not to be sensitive or feel your emotions or things like that, but just that sense that, you know what, sometimes we got to go up to someone and maybe have a plan and say, I'm going to, you know, we're using the example of talking to someone about Christ, since that's what we've been using here. I'm going to go up and talk to them, and the only thing I care that they say is if they accept what I'm teaching them. If they blow me off, then I don't care. I'm just going to leave. Going to walk away. And that's what I mean by that. And it's not always easy. I mean, because let's say you go talk to 10 people and they all say, no, I'm not interested in anything like that. That's a morale killer, isn't it? I mean, it is. I mean, honestly. I mean, I not that I take credit or score and I say, oh, well, I helped save this person, or this is another one I added to the list. But anytime that I study with someone and they do not become a Christian, I have an awful lot of prayer and thinking that I personally go through, because it bothers me, because I'm afraid that I said something wrong, and that's not the right way to do. You shouldn't, you know, I'm never going to talk to anyone ever again, but I beat myself up. And I know, I teach you guys, and we talk about this, and we know that not everyone's going to listen, not everyone's going to accept, not everyone's going to be willing to hear. But anytime that I say that, anytime that I sit down and someone doesn't come to the conclusion. Now, there's a difference, because there's been times that I know that people came to the conclusion. They told me as much, but it wasn't what they wanted. And not that doesn't bother me, but I don't take offense to that one as much, because I'm not attacking myself and saying, what did I do wrong? What should I have said more? What should I have done here? And I'm just trying to point out, you know, what was Paul talking about here in Philippians 1:21, where he said, to me to live is Christ. What did he mean? Because remember what he's talking about there. You know, all the negative things in the world, and I believe Philippians 1:20, he's also talking about his, you know, warring with his body. I think that's the one. I might be confusing that one. But anyhow, to me, to live to Christ is my life. Everything important in it adds up to him. You know, and Paul talks about the idea that, you know, while he's here, he's suffering. And while he's here, he's warring with his physical body. But as long as he's here, he's going to live for Christ. He's going to do everything he can to serve him. And I tell you what, that's one guy that, if you read a little bit about, if you read a little bit about Paul, you'd almost sometimes look at what he says and say, was that man ever afraid? I think he was, but I think he used his fear in a positive way. You know, that way of not holding me back. But you know what, what would be the worst thing? And maybe think of it from this perspective. We'll move on to the next point and we'll finish up here. But what would be the worst thing? Someone telling you they don't want to hear about God or the Bible from you anymore? Or God looking at you and not saying, well done, good and faithful servant? And I think maybe that would bring some perspective to it. Because that's what I don't want to hear. I mean, I don't want to hear someone I teach the gospel to not accept it either. But personally for me, I'm going to take a denial here and there and someone not accepting and continue to be a Christian because I want to go to heaven. And I want to be there with God. Eric?
That song, Never Mentioned Me.
Yeah.
That would be worse.
Yeah.
If you said something and they rejected that. If you didn't say anything and they looked at you in judgment and said, you never mentioned me.
You know, it's like running up to someone in a crowd that you haven't seen in a really long time and you're all excited and you say hi to them and they look at you and go, who are you? You know, and that would be horrible. Because in a sense, it's not that God doesn't know his creation, but in a sense, you stayed with sin, so I didn't get to know you. I couldn't be a part of that. And then I'll ask one more question here. We're getting close. Is it wrong to run away from something we're afraid of? Not always. Good answer. Yeah, that could have been a trick question. Sometimes there's things that we're afraid of that we just have to look to God and say, I have to stand here. I have to go through this. And there are other things where it's us staying there is not going to be a benefit. And it's sometimes best just to say, I'm going to get out of here so that I don't fall, so that I don't sin. Maybe I'll come back to this environment again when I'm stronger, if it's an environment that would, work to that. But fear, we do need to understand, we can either face it or run from it. And it depends on the situation on which one we should do. I mean, talking about all this not being afraid, okay? So I want you to picture something. You're walking through the African plains. Okay, you're all by yourself, just out for a stroll. And all of a sudden, this big lioness comes from out of the bushes. What do you say? Do you say, well, we just studied fear at church, and I'm not supposed to be afraid. So I'm just going to stand here, and I'm going to let God protect me. What's that? Well, yeah, running's probably not going to help you anyways. But maybe a gazelle or an impala will get in the way while you're running and you'll get saved that way. God will send some intervention. But what it comes down to is, sure, there's times that I think that's why fear is healthy. Sometimes fear can say, you need to run. You need to get out of here. And one example that I'll point out right now from the Bible that you guys will all know very clearly is Joseph. Remember when he was in Potiphar's house? Potiphar's wife. What did he do? He stood there and said, well, you're my master's wife, so I have to listen to you. Took off. Yeah. Because there wasn't anything good that was going to happen with him staying there. Even if he stood his ground and waited for Potiphar to come back, nothing good could have come out of that from him staying there in that environment. Nothing good came out of the aspect of that until the end, but yeah. And how many people said to him, why don't you just kill him? I mean, it wasn't his job. That wasn't, God anointed him. God's going to put me in power when he does, and that was it. But you're right, yeah, it's another example. David could have just said, I'm anointed. I'm going to do this. But yeah, I'm sure he was afraid of Saul to some aspects. I mean, David didn't seem to be afraid of anyone. He went up against Goliath, but still, there was fear there. But it didn't stop him. That wasn't the reason he didn't. So yeah, sometimes we need to run away from what we have. And then just finally here, we need to balance courage with wisdom. The more Bible knowledge we have, the more prayer we have with God, the closer we are with him, and the more wisdom we're going to have. Ecclesiastes 3, verse 7, a time to keep silent and a time to speak. And you know what? We also need to even sometimes feel guilty. You know, what if there's something we were afraid of that we should have done? You know, and later on we feel guilty about that. That's good. Yeah. You know, it says up there on the slide that many never completely rid themselves of fear. I'll tell you this, I don't think anybody ever completely rids themselves of fear, but we can learn to control it. I think fear is an aspect of life. I think fear is something that we should be okay with even having in our lives, but not if it controls us. We need to control that fear. Is there any other questions, comments, anything else that anyone would like to add? All right. I'm going to continue to try to come up with topical type studies like this for Sunday night so that we have something more that we can look into. I have no idea what we're going to be studying next Sunday night yet. I'll figure that out sometime this week, unless somebody has some ideas or something that they would like to. But right now, I'd like to offer the invitation for anyone here that has any need, whether to be baptized into Christ. Maybe you need some prayers of encouragement. If you do, just come on forward up here to where I'm standing, and we'll pray for you. And if there's anyone here that has a need, please come forward now as we stand and sing.